That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The British Constitution provides that taxation and representation shall go together. Therefore, women taxpayers are entitled to vote.
I have a dream today. Let freedom ring, and if America is to be a great nation, this must become true.
Hello, welcome to episode 12 of the Only Human podcast. Once again, I'm Tony Kern, and I will be your host again today as we talk about technology. How do we use it? More importantly, how does it change the way we think and perform? So technology covers a lot of ground. So in order to manage it for this little 30-minute-ish podcast, today we're going to talk about where we meet technology most frequently in the digital world with this. This is my Samsung S23 Ultra, I think. Got a lot of features on it. I spent a lot of time with it. And we're going to talk about what spending time in a digital world with our cell phone does to us in the way of how we think about how we think, and how we perform. So I've titled this episode Wired Minds. So let's jump right into this fascinating intersection of technology and the human brain. Today, we're going to explore how the digital world impacts our thinking, our behavior, the things that we can do to understand it and hopefully use it to our advantage instead of it using us to their advantage, whoever there is, right? So whether you're swiping your phone to catch up with the latest feeds, maybe doing a little gaming, or maybe even a little work, or just listening to our humble podcast here today, technology is an integral part of our lives. But at what cost? That's what we want to find out. At what cost to our thinking? Which brings us to the Blue Threat proverb of the week. We may have actually used it before, but it's perfect for this one. It's Blue Threat proverb number 9. It's hard to fight an enemy that has outposts in your head. So what does that really mean? What does that really mean? First, it's a quote from Anais Nin, pretty fascinating lady if you want to look her up. Digital technology is designed to put outposts in our heads. A long time ago, there was a gentleman, a sociologist named Marshall McLuhan. Marshall McLuhan has a very famous phrase. He says, the medium is the message. The medium is the message. Now, this is long before cell phones came around. And what he meant by that is that we value the content in a hardback book more than we value the content in a daily newspaper. We value the content of an expert more than we value the content of so-called average people, whatever that means. So what he was beginning to tell us is that how we receive information, how we receive communication is in and of itself shaping how we think about and value that communication. And that's really important. And we're going to get into this evolution of technology and integration into our daily life, a little history lesson that I think you'll find fascinating in just 1 minute after a word from our sponsor.
Never events occur with or without negative outcomes. Just because something bad didn't happen doesn't mean a never event didn't occur. I want you to start calling these events out. We're going to hold each other accountable. We're going to make that commitment today that says, hey, that was an improper movement. Why are we doing that? That is not who we are. That's not the way we do things. Because if I can fix that behavior, I can fix that consequence. Because if I don't, those behaviors become normalized and they get taught to the next person and the next person and the next person. Before you know it, and it's out of control.
Visit convergentperformance.com and sign up for Aviation Maintenance Never Events, a proven program that can save your company millions of dollars annually.
All right, in segment 1, we're going to start with a question. I want you to think back, if you can, when was the last time you spent a day without any digital device input? Pretty tough question, right? And I think for most of you, it's going to be the last time you were out of range of any sort of digital coverage. And even then, you may have had stuff stored, right, on there just in case you ran out of coverage. It's pretty tough. I think it's important that we look at how all of this has occurred over a relatively short period of time. Technology's growth from clunky computers of the early 20th century to today's really cool, sleek smartphones, which will, in a couple of years, say we're clunky and out of date, is nothing short of revolutionary. And it's mind-boggling to me, and I use that term intentionally, mind-boggling, because for those of us that lived prior to the onset of the internet and cell phones, I suspect you feel the same way. It's changed the way you think. It's changed the things you are capable of doing. Right? I grew up, and I suspect a few of my listeners here did as well, in an era without remote controls for anything, right? If you wanted to change the channel on our TV, someone, usually me as the youngest child, had to get up, walk over to a large piece of furniture, right, which usually dominated the living room. TVs were in big cabinets, and we had to actually turn a knob, right? Usually you had 3 channels, ABC, NBC, and CBS. Maybe with a good little round antenna on the back of your TV, you could pick up some UHF channels from the local area too. And that way you could say, wow, that was all you had? That's all we knew. And we thought it was pretty cool. Here's what the good news is. It was absolutely free. It just came through the air, right? Crazy, crazy times. If we wanted to use a telephone, we lifted a receiver off of a desk or wall phone. Typically, if you were right-handed, you put the receiver in your left hand and you would dial a rotary number. And if it was a local number, it was a 7-digit number. If you go way back, it was a little less than that. But and we had a lot of these numbers memorized. And then even then, often there were other people that shared the same exact line. They were called party lines. They could pick up their phone and listen to everything you're saying. Typically, they'd pick it up, you'd hear them, and then they hang up. And that was your signal that you should probably get off because they needed to use the phone. If they really needed you to use the line, they'd ask you. And you would simply agree, and then you'd check with them, and they'd check with you, and maybe you'd get to make your phone call later. Crazy, right? So those days are long gone. And today, our lives are completely intertwined with digital technology. It's how we work. It's how we relax, maybe. It's how we connect. Whether it's waking up to the alarm on our phone or tracking our sleep or maybe our fitness, to how we connect with everything available on the internet, technology is a constant companion. But as we embrace these digital tools, and we have little choice in the matter, right? That's part of this equation. We don't really have a choice anymore. We have to ask ourselves, how is it reshaping the way that we think? How is it reshaping and impacting the way we perform? So I want to get into a little deeper look here as to how we got to where we're at, and maybe some of the impacts that those of us that lived before and now during have seen, and what that means to all of us. As we sit here today, there are over 5.6 billion cell phone accounts and users in the world. That's 2 out of every 3 people on this planet. And it involves 94% of the adult population. All of us, basically. Pilot math, 94% is everybody. All of our brains are being filled with whatever content comes at us through this one simple device we can no longer seem to live without. So I want you to take a moment. I ask you to think about when's the last time you went a day without digital content. I want you to take a moment and think about how often you check your phone. Right? Every day, is it the first thing you reach for in the morning? Is it the last thing you look at night? There's a lot of studies out there and surveys. Most of them suggest that the average person, I hate that term, if such a thing actually exists, right? But the average digital consumer adult checks their phone about 58 times a day. 58 times a day. Teenagers do it almost 100 times more a day, 154 times a day. That's That's a lot, right? In America, the average adult spends 3 to 4 hours a day directly looking at or listening to their smartphone. Once again, teenagers and young adults are even more engaged, with an average screen time of 5 to 7 hours a day. And some, what they call high-use teens, literally spend every waking moment when they're not in school or they have to, maybe when they're driving a little bit, but maybe when they're eating, but literally every waking moment with their eyes glued to their phone. Hadn't always been this way. Let's review how we got here. The evolution of the smartphone. I mean, Nikola Tesla was talking about it, back before the dawn of electricity. He understood what was going to be coming. But for us, we can trace it back over several decades. And interestingly, I've lived through them all as an adult. And it really wasn't all that long ago. So let's look at how this happened to us. And then we'll dive into the impacts on our thinking and our behaviors. So the first commercial mobile phone, the Motorola Dynatac 8000X, was introduced in 1983, 40 years ago. Right? It was bulky and it was expensive. I had one. It came with my new Chevy truck. That was like the bonus. Buy a new Chevy truck and get a mobile phone. It looked like something you'd call in a strike, an airstrike from Vietnam or something. It had a big battery and a satchel you had to carry around. It had a big handset. It was a monster, right? It was relatively unuseful. I remember when I got it, I had a little spot on my drive into the base when I was working. I was in the military, lived in Abilene, Texas, and I would call work just to let them know I had a mobile phone. Hey, yeah, no, I'm on my mobile phone. I'm calling for my truck. What? No, I'm on my mobile phone calling for my truck. Yeah. What? It was more of a novelty, but it was a really cool novelty, right? And I was an early adopter of this technology, and I realized right away that it wasn't going to change anything, right? Nothing. It was worthless. Well, by the late 1980s, they began to shrink in size, mostly because batteries became smaller, right? And they also began to shrink in price. And so it became more accessible, but it was still kind of a professional class business tool, right? The big brands back then were Motorola and BlackBerry. And if you were in the government, you had to have a BlackBerry, right? You got them issued and you thought, super cool. I had one of each, but at the same time, coverage was still limited. So we didn't really use them very much. But they were very important to many employers, including the federal government, who could now reach you well outside of normal work hours. And they did. And that's where our life really began to change. When we were promised that the whole computer age would allow us to work anytime from anywhere, we didn't really catch what they really meant was all the time from everywhere. And this trend really began in the late 1980s, but still coverage was limited, but the technology was getting better, right? And this trend continued through the 90s as phones got smaller and more sophisticated and the coverage expanded. So by the early 2000s, cell phones had become a little bit more mainstream and ownership rapidly expanded outside of the workforce, especially adults in urban and suburban areas where that was the only place that had cell phone coverage, right? Interestingly, back then, the real estate market began to notice. And you began to see on every home that was out there in the small towns on the periphery of the coverage area, it would say good cell phone coverage, good mobile coverage. And that would actually raise the price of the listings in the area. Well, as we rolled into the new century and other people got involved, more affordable models, we began to see things like family plans. Cell phone use began to spread now away from adults and into who it would impact more than anybody else, teenagers. And this was also the era when we began to see our first feature phones, flip phones with texting capability, internet access, and maybe a little limited multimedia capabilities. Because at the same time, the confluence of the cell phone technology and coverage and affordability came the evolution of the internet, right? And so we began to get some really limited multimedia capabilities. Excuse me for a second. By 2000 and by the mid portion of the first decade of this century, right, it was increasingly common for teenagers to own cell phones and to begin the whole acronym of texting. Right? And this was the dawn of something else that would change our lives. About the same time, social media came into play. Okay? Platforms like Friendster in 2002, MySpace in 2003, and the big one that's still around, Facebook in 2004. Initially, these were almost exclusively web-based and accessed via desktop computers. But those businessmen and women could see the writing on the wall, and they began to quickly change some things. And as much as that whole thing of technology and coverage and social media kind of advanced the use of cell phones, everything changed in 2007. It was the dawn of the smartphone revolution, and guess who introduced it? In 2007, Apple introduced the iPhone. And that was really the first smartphone. And it marked a really big difference in how phones were used because it integrated the internet, entertainment, texting, music, and voice communication all in one device. Back to Marshall McLuhan, the medium's a message. If you're getting everything through the same medium, are you beginning to think differently about how valuable the message is? Remember, we used to give a lot more credence to something that was in a hard copy book that had been peer reviewed that we got out of a library than we did in the Daily Rag newspaper. And so what was happening in our brains right then is pretty interesting. And that's proliferated over the last 15 or 20 years. So between 2008, 2010, there was a rapid proliferation of smartphones, and we got an alternative to the iPhone. I'm an Android guy. The Android platform made these devices far more accessible to a broader audiences. It became a necessity rather than a luxury. People of all ages began to integrate them both into their personal and their professional lives. And then came something else. The mobile apps for gaming. A whole new thing on how people, especially young people, spent their leisure time. No longer did you have to sit with an Xbox or whatever it was back then. Heck, you could do it on your phone. And simultaneously, all of the social media things, Facebook, Twitter, now X, and LinkedIn, became increasingly popular ways of communicating. And they started developing mobile apps that were used on the cell phone. They recognized the shift toward mobile internet use. But history lesson is coming to an end here, so just hang with me. By about 2015, smartphones had become ubiquitous. I like that word, ubiquitous. It kind of flows off your tongue. It just means everywhere. Cool sounding word that means everywhere. Almost every adult in a developed country owned a smartphone. And it was becoming increasingly common in developing nations as the towers went up and the microwaves went out. Older adults who maybe were initially, were reluctant to adopt a smartphone began to use them more widely, especially as it became available to be able to reach out to their family, their children, their grandchildren. But another weirder thing happened right about 2015, 2016. Children under 10 started getting cell phones from their parents, and they took them to school. And of course, teenagers always took them to school. And initially, when a child got a cell phone, it came with a pretty good warning about, parental supervision and all of that. But over time, that's all changed. It became an entertainment device, a babysitting device, if you will. And we began to see people whose minds were literally developing in tremendous ways at the same time, having them shaped through their entire growth process by smartphones. Then, of course, the explosion of social media happened. Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, they're all mobile apps, right? platforms designed for mobile-first experiences, photo, video content, short-form content across the board. So here we are today, where literally almost every adult on the planet has a cell phone with content being pushed at them across the board. What about tomorrow? Every historian thinks he's a futurist, so I'll throw a few ideas out there. I think the integration of smartphones into daily life is complete. The technology will certainly get better. But I think there's a couple of things that are happening. I think 5G and I think artificial intelligence are going to be able to make data move faster and content be more manipulated, or some people would say shaped for your specific desires. I think they're not going to ask your desires. They're going to infer them from what we see and what we look at. Every click is tracked. I've said it before. When you get something for free, like a lot of the internet, you're not the customer, you're the product. Right? So I think you're going to see more of that. And I think in a few decades, humans will think dramatically different than they do right now. And I think it's going to have a good bit of impact on how we perform. So let's move on to section 2, the mental effects, the cognitive effects that this technology is having on our brain. Human brain's incredibly adaptable, and we've adapted. Even an old dinosaur like me's adapted. But I don't know how fast I can adapt to keep pace of what's happening to me behind the scenes. Back to my blue threat proverb of it's hard to fight an enemy that has outposts in your head. If I'm being groomed, shaped, and manipulated to think in certain ways and join certain tribes and believe certain things and buy certain products, how much control do I really have over that? Right? So that's one thing. The other thing is basic attention span. I have a hard time now sitting down and reading a book. This is a great book. I've talked to you about it before, Logic of Failure. If I sit down for 2 or 3 minutes reading this book, I get bored. I have to get myself primed to slow down my attention span to read and understand content that's coming to me through a printed form that I used to love. I still love, right? So I'm fighting for that. That's been hugely valuable to me. I've always learned from reading, and so it's vitally important that I keep that skill, and so I'm fighting for it. A lot of other people just have stopped reading because they perceive there's no need to. Back to Marshall McLuhan, the median's the message. If everything's coming at you shaped and prepackaged for you, of course it's going to be pleasurable. Of course you're going to prefer it because that's what they want you to, right? So let me ask you a couple of other questions about our attention. Our attention and our memory are the two things that this digital technology has impacted already. When was the last time you memorized a phone number? When was the last time you used a printed map to get where you're going? Right? Our reliance on digital devices for storing information and doing tasks that require a bit of thinking has impacted our long-term memory for certain, because it doesn't seem necessary anymore. Why bother remembering a phone number or reading a map when you've got it on your phone? We are maybe unintentionally tying ourselves to a single mode of failure, right? Maybe someday cell phones aren't available because of some sort of natural disaster or any other possible reason. Could be war, could be a bunch of things, but would we even be able to find things anymore? If we had to make an emergency phone call when our car broke down and we were outside of cell phone coverage, could we even remember a number? Right? And you could say, well, it's on here somewhere, you just got to figure it out. Why would we bother remembering anything when we have it at our fingertips? And then there's other effects like critical thinking and curiosity. When there's an answer that's just a Google search away, are we losing our ability to analyze and solve complex problems independently? And I'm going to tell you, at least from where I sit, the answer is yes, definitely. If I can't find a YouTube video on something, I no longer sit with a small engine and scratch my head and say, okay, it's got to have fuel, it's got to have a spark, it's got to have air. Let's work through those independently. And gosh, I used to love working on small engines with that thought process, and I could usually get them running. Now, I look it up, and if the guy goes, try this, try that, he's already done his thinking for me, so I don't have to puzzle it out anymore. I don't have to suss it out. That bothers me. I really enjoy problem solving, and that's kind of been taken away from me, or I've allowed it to have been taken away from me. Those are some of the cognitive things, or the mental things. Let's talk about, in our last segment here, behavioral changes due to technology. Moving from the mind to behavior, technologies revolutionize the way we interact with everybody, right? Social media platforms have created, I guess, the way to connect, along with text. Put bluntly, people don't talk much anymore. Instead, we text, we post, we send each other memes. Our verbal abilities, once were essential to our professional and personal growth, have frankly atrophied. Ton of studies that show that, especially in teenagers. Online, we create personas. It's kind of like a highlight reel of our lives, but this can lead to a disconnect between our digital personalities or identities and our real life selves, right? To the point where we don't want people to really see us because we don't have a filter. You've heard me talk before about our multiple identities, our public identity, right? Our online identity, our private one, the one that only a few people that actually see us and talk to us know. Secret identity, the one that we keep only in our inner self, and then our true identity, which is some mix of all those things. Technology's made it all so much more complicated, right? As country music star Brad Paisley likes to say it, I'm so much cooler online. which in turn leads us to a next thing that really so many of us tend to isolate behind the small screens where we can control what people see and what people hear from us. I mean, even this podcast, I don't do 2 takes or 3 takes. There's no cut and paste in this. What you get is a kind of a flow of my thoughts for 30 minutes or so. But when we begin to isolate behind a small screen, it does begin to change who we are and what we value. So now I want to talk about the really dark side, digital addiction. Have you ever felt anxious when you can't find your phone? Right? Your heart rate goes up, your blood pressure goes up, all this stuff has been studied. Online content's designed to hook us, to keep us engaged. And let's be honest, sometimes we get obsessed with a lot of it. And this phenomena called digital addiction really can disrupt our personal, our professional, our family lives. And it's becoming increasingly common. Some studies out there indicate that about 40% of the population in the US and in other developed countries show signs of digital addiction. Well, what are those signs? And they're pretty profound. It's not just time you spend on device and away from something else. It's found that people that are digitally addicted have a 15% higher stress level, which results in multiple years being shaved off the end of your life. Right? On a personal scale, these vary from person to person. There's obviously the loss of productivity. If an average adult is spending 4 to 5 hours daily on a smartphone, they're not doing other stuff unless that is the other stuff. Also disrupt sleep patterns. 1 in 3 people have reported experiencing poor sleep quality due to late night screen time. I got to tell you, last night I had an idea and I couldn't get it out of my head. I woke up at 3:43. You know what I did? I grabbed my smartphone here. I pulled out what is called my S Pen, and I started to write some stuff to myself on my phone so that I wouldn't forget it in the morning. Take that iPhone. You can't do that. You probably can with something else. But long story short, even though I know this, I can't really stop myself. And it's a pretty handy device, don't get me wrong. There's a toll on our mental health with links to anxiety and depression that are associated with both of those things. Reduced sleep, fractured attention, and increased stress. So the question becomes, what can we do about it? Obviously, awareness is a first step. It's crucial to realize the signs like compulsively checking your devices and neglecting real world social interactions. There are some steps we can take to mitigate this addiction. And you probably have heard them all before, and you probably know them all. Set screen time limits. Take regular periods in your day for digital detox. I'll turn my phone off. I do not turn it on and check it first thing in the morning. I tend to get up around 6, and I won't turn my phone on until at least 8 o'clock. That gives me a couple of hours in the morning to get up and do some things, right? I spend time outside, away from offline activities. I'm trying hard to create a balanced digital lifestyle that fits my balance, not some demanded balance from someplace else. So change is possible. With a little bit of conscious effort, we can harness the positives of the digital world, and we don't have to succumb to its addictive potential. Remember, technology is supposed to be the tool to improve our lives, not wreck it, right? And so it's just a matter of striking the right balance. But that's on each of us, right? The tech companies who build these things, the digital companies that build the apps to hook us and keep us glued to the screen, that's their job. And we need to understand they're very good at it. And we need to be able to make some personal choices to keep our brains and our behaviors true to who we are and not be herded into some deeper dependence. As I like to say, at least a couple times a day, boycott the attention economy. Take your life back. Well, I guess that's a wrap for episode 12. As we wrap up this segment, I want you to think a little bit more and a little deeper about how technology might be dominating your daily routines, how it might be impacting and hurting your attention span and your focus, how it impacts your critical thinking and your social interactions. All these are really important parts of our overall lives. Make a few intentional decisions about how you really want to use your digital technology and how you want to live your life. And as always, how you can get better in all the ways that matter to you. Finally, keep the feedback coming, because after all, I too am only human, and I will see you soon.